I was at the FCC for a long time, 30-something years, and the last 8 or 10 years I headed up amateur radio enforcement, in addition to being deputy chief of licensing at the Gettysburg office. And when I retired, I continued to work with the FCC and the league on some of the issues in amateur radio, and coordinate regularly with the person who took my job at the FCC, Laura Smith. And so I just wanted to give you a background of the volunteer monitor program, and not to bore you with details, but there was a meeting between the league and the FCC in November 2017 to discuss overall enforcement in the amateur service. The FCC had lost about half of its field offices or personnel, and half of its field offices, although the monitoring stations, there are 13 antenna fields around the country. They're still there. The antenna farms, they're all tied into Columbia, Maryland. But it was pretty clear with budget cuts that the staff was going to be less and less and less and less able to work on amateur radio matters. And in case you wonder what the FCC does, go to fcc.gov website sometime and look up the FCC Daily Digest. It will absolutely amaze you all the things that the FCC has to be involved in that aren't basically RF, from internet to universal service fraud and about everything else. It's a wonder they have time to do anything for us or anything RF. But the FCC promised that if we would have a new and enhanced program to replace the OO program, they would participate in training and have regular meetings with us. And they assured us that cases that we had would not go through the basic complaint system portal at the FCC, that they would take them on directly and personally, which they have done. So we had several meetings in this regard, and finally, in 2019, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the FCC and the league, and the FCC felt about 150 monitors would be about a manageable size, and we were responsible for training them and enhancing what they were capable of doing, along with the FCC. So we started taking applications in July of 2019, and we got about 200 applications, and we just really went chronologically. All of the applications were good, and when around 150 to 175, we stopped, and we accepted the rest of them into the reserve pool, which we have had to use because of COVID and the aging out of some of the volunteer monitors, some accidents, tower accidents, and just old age, and someone just got tired of doing it. And the FCC viewed the program as a force multiplier for them, since they had lost so many field offices, and I don't see that coming back anytime. The FCC is just very short-staffed. The staffing level is down to what it was in the 1950s. So now getting to what we do, the volunteer monitors went through their training, and they're looking for certain violations that are meaningful violations. We don't ping somebody because they identified after 20 minutes rather than 10 or whatever. And just looking at the 2023 VM program stats, the volunteer monitors turned in, and this is a number that boggles my mind. I checked it and rechecked it, audited it, and everything else, but it's an accurate number. They turned in 24,000 hours monitoring VHF frequencies in 2023, I should say. Now, advisory notices, which we issued from my office here, were 147. And when you consider the thousands and thousands of hours monitoring, just to have 147 situations that they detected that required some attention is phenomenal, I think. We issued over 20 good operator letters, and I'll get to those in a minute and why and how we issue those. And there were 9 referrals to the FCC and a couple of referrals from the FCC, and we had 9 meetings with the FCC. And I had club and group meetings, either virtual or in person, on about 8 occasions. So we issued 147 advisory notices culled out of 364 violation reports, which means that only about half of them, less than half of them, were worthy of issuing an advisory notice. Because our goal is not to aggravate everybody in the amateur radio service. Our goal is not to ping somebody because they make a simple mistake, or for 1 minute a technician gets on a general class frequency. And it's obvious that with the 1 minute transmission, they discovered the mistake. We were going after the violations that degrade the services for everybody, such as deliberate interference, obscenities, language, harassment, net harassment, and so forth. Now, I want to say that I have measured and remeasured the recidivism rate, and I hate to use the recidivism rate because that's usually related to prison systems. But the repeat rate of violations after we've sent out an advisory notice is less than 0.5%. And to me, that's phenomenal. It means that they are listening and reading our letters. Those that did not comply with it repeatedly, we have sent to the FCC. So the overall incident reports, for 2023 were 364, but only about 150 required a letter or some action from this office. Some things we'll handle by email. It just depends on the nature of the violation and the person. You can tell a lot about an amateur operator by looking at their K4Z site. It's just amazing what you can learn about somebody. And if that site's filled with hate and complaining about other operators and bitching and all that, that's one kind of person. If it's filled with the kind of equipment they built, how long they've been an amateur, how they got their license, and all the things they're active in, that is a good indicator of that person. So basically every year we've gotten about 100 to 200 incident reports, but only about 10 a month are really actionable. And I have an illustrative month here that I wanted to read to you. This is February 2024 of this year. Now these volunteer monitor program reports are in QST every month. And you should be reading them as you should be reading QST, because the league is all we got standing between amateur radio and oblivion. Because after over 20 years in this business, I haven't met any other entity or organization that had the interest of amateur radio at heart. Commercial entities would love to have our frequencies. Rest of them don't care, but the league is the only one fighting for us nationally and internationally. They are the only ones standing between the FCC and oblivion. The FCC wouldn't mind deregulating as many services as it could. It makes their job easier. But the league is a very strong advocate. But for this report in February, and this is typical, operators in Indiana and North Carolina received advisory notices for improper bandwidth. They were over 6 to 10 kilohertz wide. And I see a lot of this, and I think it's because they just don't know how to adjust this equipment. They're overdriving it. They don't use ALC. Of course, they're using, in most cases, more power than necessary. I've never understood exactly why we get so many of them. And for this coming month that I haven't released yet, there's going to be about 5 or 6 that were incredibly wide and splattering. And this is equipment that you don't have to tune up. This is just equipment that does the work itself. And unless you have the ALC set wrong or you're overdriving it, it's not gonna mess up. But we have a lot of those. There was one advisory notice for interference on 3933, and that matter went to the FCC. We sent advisory notices to technician operators in Florida, Minnesota, and North Carolina for FT8 operation on 40 meters. And as you know, techs have no privileges regarding data on 40 meters, although they can do CW, which has never made a lot of sense to me, but I didn't write that rule. And I wonder why that has happened so many times on 40 meters until I saw a few weeks ago a great big poster of a band chart that was handed out at a amateur event down in Virginia, and it's by one of the main equipment manufacturers. And when you look at that, when you look at the data in CW color code on 40 meters, it's very confusing. And most of this is not intentional. Some of it is, but most of it isn't. And I say that because in 90% of the cases where we send out an advisory to a technician operator on 40 meters that was doing FT8, they called us up in a panic. And they did not realize that. They didn't read the band plan correctly. And they honestly thought they could operate on 7.074. And you can't say that for 20 meters because that's clear, but most of the tech violations of the data limits are on 40 meters. But I don't consider that a big problem considering how many technicians we have. And I think a lot of them will do it deliberately just to get by with it, or they get carried away with FT8. But I think by far most of them just are genuinely confused. And so I'm willing to take that disadvantage because FT8 has rejuvenated amateur radio. And the band plan that I'm talking about is back over here. I have it rolled up in a tube. I'm going to send it to the league and see if they can get the manufacturer to rewrite it. It's one of the manufacturer publications of the band plan. And I think we're going to try to get that straightened out. It's not a big problem. And like I say, we have no repeat rate in those instances. We sent an advisory notice for operation on a 60-meter frequency that was not assigned to amateur operators in the United States. That's most unusual. And we issued a commendation for sustained extraordinary efforts in getting elementary students on the air during a school roundup event on 20 meters. And that's a typical month. You'll see more. You won't see many, but you're going to see more and more good operator commendation raised less than 0.5%. Now let's see. I went over the good operator commendations, and I'm going to show you in a minute. Well, I can get to that right now. You'll see some, not many, but you'll see some good operator commendations. And these situations are, for example, somebody trying to resolve an argument, trying to diplomatically resolve an argument, or somebody that runs a net and they're willing to move a few kilohertz, even though they don't have to, because somebody is objecting to the net meeting on that frequency because it was, quote, their frequency, or they had a schedule there or something like that. 90% of the problems in the amateur service can easily be solved if someone would just move a few kilohertz. And that's why when you look at all the radio catalogs from 1960 on through yesterday, all these transceivers have one big knob. It's the idiot filter. Just turn the frequency. We got thousands and thousands of frequencies. So you hear people arguing over frequency that they were there first or they were getting ready to call CQ and the net came on. It's just a cross-section of society. Society today is rude, it's boisterous, it's ungrateful, takes everything for granted, and assumes an insult when no insult was meant. Society today reminds me of Charles Manson's interview with Diane Sawyer after he was sentenced. This is prophetic, and it still scares me sometimes. Charles Manson said it used to be it was something to be crazy, but today everybody's getting crazy. And if he wasn't a prophet in that interview, I don't know what is, because that's just the way it is. And maybe it's the way the pendulum is swinging, and surely it'll swing back. But we look for excellence in these good operator accommodations. And excellence to us is caring more than others think wise, helping when you don't have to, helping a newcomer, helping somebody understand the rules without berating them or without belittling them, risking more than others think safe. For example, volunteering to move when you don't have to, working more, dreaming more than others think practical. And those are the people that work for clubs and nets and new licensee classes, and expecting more than others think possible. We've issued a few of these advisory or these accommodations for somebody who helped diffuse an altercation on the frequency. We know from years and years and years of monitoring that over 80% of interference is unintentional, absolutely unintentional. With today's rigs, with split frequencies, with the strange propagation on 40 meters, for example, certain times of the year, it just happens. And the new rigs we have are nice, but they're complicated as far as getting the settings right. And somebody operating split can interfere and they won't even know it at first. So we have to cut people a break. And I have several messages to different groups that I always like to bring up. To the nets, the regular nets, all the regular nets are really to be commended. You have some of these nets that have met for 30 and 40 years on the same frequency, with the net controls working hard to have a good net. I don't have to tell you who they are. I'm sure you're members of some of them. But it doesn't matter that you've been on that same frequency that long. All frequencies are shared. And so we issued an advisory to a net last month who just jumped all over a person and berated that person who was unintentionally interfering with him calling CQ. And it's quite obvious that the person had been operating split and didn't realize it at first. But the net control jumped all over him and just made a fool out of him on the band. That's not necessary. It's not necessary to do that. Now, there are groups of operators. You'll find them on 75 meters. In fact, don't go to 2 or 3 frequencies I'm going to give you on 75 meters, because after 20 years of personal research, I know that these 3 frequencies cause brain damage, and they are the only amateur radio frequencies that cause it. That's 3927, 3860, and 3927. So just don't go there. It's the same group of people have been that way for years, just on the borderline of violations. We're calling them out gradually. Father Time's taking care of a couple of them. The Grim Reaper's helping. But just don't go there, because even listening to them, you will get brain damage. That's 3860, 3927, and also on occasion 7200 in the late afternoons. Just avoid them if you can. Wine attracts those people. And some of these people, we know exactly who they are. One person has $15,000 worth of ham equipment, and he uses it as if they were juvenile delinquents with walkie-talkies. It just amazes me. I don't understand these people, and it's like my grandfather told me when I was a kid, some people are just crazy as hell, and if you understood them, you'd be as crazy as they are. So just don't worry about it. They vote, they drive, they make children, but they're crazy. And I think that's very true. It's not going to hurt you, some of these people, to vary the frequency. And to the widebanders, which is starting to concern me, if you want to run a broadcast station, just get a low power license or get a broadcast license and do it. There's no place on crowded frequencies for wideband operators. It's rude and inconsiderate. To the contesters, I would say use a little more courtesy, and remember that even when you operate split, you don't on a frequency. To the traffic nets, I would say listen to the contesters. They're the best operators in the world. Some of the traffic nets will take 3 minutes to pass a 1-sentence message using phonetics when you already know they're 20 dB over. It's just not necessary. Listen to contesters. They're great operators. And to those who don't like contesters, I say just lighten up. They're short-lived. It's over soon, and they don't use the warp bands. And to the de-expeditions. Some people, for some reason, hate de-expeditions. But, if these folks are willing to go and sit on a rock in the ocean, or sit in the desert and swat scorpions and mosquitoes and everything else that comes along, just let them do it. They're short-lived as well, and it costs a lot of money and a lot of effort to go on a de-expedition. Those who don't like FT8, I worked a DX station the other night, and I went to the website. I like to go to the website on K4Z to know who I've talked to, and you see a lot of nice equipment. You get a lot of ideas on how to configure it and so forth. But this guy was I think it was a German station. Anyway, he had a caption on his K4Z site that said FT8 is like, it said CW is like FT8, only it's for adults. So he obviously doesn't like FT8, but FT8 has rejuvenated amateur radio in a similar way that Echolink rejuvenated repeaters 20 years ago. FT8 has just, it's a great following. They're very active people, and it's rejuvenated the entire amateur radio service. To repeater owners, emphasize to repeater owners that they don't own that frequency just because they're coordinated for that frequency. And there are 22,000 repeaters in the United States. And they don't have to have a repeater. They do it out of choice. And so you can't expect automatically the FCC or the Volunteer Monitor Program to regulate the repeater if somebody's not following the rules. It's no different than leaving the doors open to your house and advertising that there's an amateur radio station in there that people can use. A repeater is the same thing. So the first effort at regulating and managing the repeater has to come from the repeater owner. And once they've done their job, we will help them, but not in the first instance. They've got to issue a stay-off letter to somebody that's abusing a repeater and go that route first. But for the fact that we have 22,000 repeaters in the country, the repeater issues aren't that bad, except, of course, in California. Los Angeles, they've always been that way. Los Angeles repeaters are an embarrassment internationally. And once when I was at the FCC, we shut down one repeater that was the worst, the W6NUT repeater. But all those crazy people went to other repeaters and ended up ruining about 10 other repeaters. So we opened up W6NUT again. At least they're all on the same repeater. You know where they are. And it gave some peace to the other operators. And to the QRPers, I would say thank you. Thank you. QRP has also rejuvenated amateur radio. And if you ever go to a QRP convention, there used to be a few days of one before Dayton every year. The enthusiasm, if I could bottle that enthusiasm, it's just amazing how exciting those people are. And, you know, for those who don't like QRPers, anybody can use a linear amplifier as a crutch. Anybody can do that. Can flip the switch and get 800 watts. Of course, you're going to get that station in Thailand or whatever. But the QRPers really are skilled, and I know a bunch of them who've gotten all kinds of awards just by learning the technique and knowing how to listen and so forth. And this theory of the big knob is critically important, because just changing the frequency, and we only have one band that's channelized, that's 60 meters. We're the only service in the world that can tune around where we want to, with all kinds of power and privileges. We can do contests. We can do anything we want to in those bands, and we're sitting on billions of dollars worth of spectrum. And it may be that a lot of our spectrum is just inherently unstable, and maybe nobody's found a better use for it yet. But I remember at the FCC, we in the early days, we laughed at the prospect of somebody being able to use 800 megahertz for anything. And then years later, we watched the multi-million-dollar auctions of 800 megahertz and other frequencies after somebody figured it out. But we're in the basic problem with amateur radio has also always been one of its basic advantages. It's a problem these days because we're a cross-section of amateur radio. And since COVID has disintegrated a lot of the ties and the bonds that we've had. And when I was growing up, we never had airline rage. We didn't have a degree of rudeness or selfishness. People didn't seem to be angry. No, we had road rage. And all of you did too, but probably we solved road rage with finger gestures. And that was it. We didn't shoot out anybody's windshield or run them off the road. But look at the road rage today. Who ever heard of airline rage 10 or 15 years ago? So the basic message that if you want to know what you can do to help amateur radio, Let's just operate as if someone who was interested in amateur radio was listening. You were being demonstrated to a son or a grandson, a daughter or a granddaughter, or a neighbor who was interested in amateur radio. That's all you have to do. Just realize that you have privileges. And when you look at your license, you don't see rights, you see privileges. And so we just have to figure out a way to pay this wonderful legacy that joyfully occupies our lives, pay it forward. And don't you feel sorry for those who don't understand the magic of radio. You can't explain it to them. It's like trying to explain how good a tube rig smells to somebody who's never owned a tube rig. And you see the HT37 and the Drake in the background here. I turn those things on and the whole room is just a different fragrance. And it brings me back to 15 years old, making my first contact. But people who didn't grow up with tube rigs, they don't understand it, and that's okay. But we need to appreciate and pay it forward the magic of radio. And the main thing that amateur radio needs is true in society generally, and that is a little more kindness. That's all it takes. You know, just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's right to do it in every circumstance. If you give a little ground, you're helping the service, and at the end of the day, it's all about preserving and enhancing amateur radio and making it last for 100 years. I used to say 1,000, but the planet won't even be here in 1,000 years, so I'll be happy with 100. But we just need to work harder to appreciate and be grateful for this avocation that joyfully occupies our lives. And in many cases, probably in your meeting there, in many cases, it led to our careers. And we have to pay it back, and we have to remember there's nobody representing amateur radio in the world except the League and a few international organizations which work for the League. We've been worried over the years about various threats to amateur radio, and I'm going to tell you in a second here what's the biggest threat. But, you know, Rick Roderick, president of the ARRL K5UR, went back and did history on the things that people thought threatened amateur radio. And in 1952, the League was promoting single sideband as a preferred phone mode. And I got licensed in 1960, and people were still making this transition from AM to single sideband. I used to hear some of the arguments that the AMers would make. You know, like it can't be amateur radio; it doesn't even have a carrier. And not only that, it sounds like a duck. What kind of radio signal is that? And they were very, very serious, very mad about that stuff. From 1963 to 1967 was the incentive licensing debate. People are still mad about that. Some of these old timers that the novice license got liberalized and the technician privileges were enhanced. In 1984, the FCC delegated license testing to volunteer examiner coordinators. Now that was controversial. All agencies did that. I don't know of a single agency that gives its own test. So it was done across the board, but I think there is some disadvantage to that because people that took their license exam in a federal building, they remember what the weather was like, where they parked, and what they were wearing. It's just something you never forget. And for a young person, a lot of times that's their first exposure to the federal government, going in this very intimidating and very impressive federal building. And coming home and later finding out you passed a federal exam. I mean, this is something. And the VEX can never make up for that. It's not their fault, but it's just the way of the world. I wish that we could still have them in the federal buildings because that definitely made an impression on young people, or actually all people. In 2007, the FCC eliminated the Morse code requirement, but the actual CW use on the air increased. And over the years, I've talked to the people who make the fancy keys and keyers that you see at Hamfest. their business increased. And to me, it probably was sort of like when you're in high school and a book gets put on the required reading list. It kind of ruins it. And later, and you're all moaning about it, but later in life, you're thinking, I'm going to read that book. I should have paid more attention to that in high school, and you'll go back and read it. But putting on a required list is just human nature. It kind of ruins it. And this is a big one. In 1991, the FCC created the no-code technician license. And I hear all the time, we need code as a filter to keep the non-serious people out. And in fact, I thought that. And when the first week I got the job to try to restore the amateur radio service after 12 years of neglect, I went down to DC to headquarters to talk to the policy people. And I said, you people have got to stay out of enforcement and we'll stay out of policy. And we'll get along fine. We'll do enforcement. We'll try to get this straightened out. But at the time I was down there is when they were thinking about eliminating the code requirement. So I told Bill Cross, I said, I will say one thing though. If you eliminate the Morse code requirement, you're crazy, because that's a filter to make sure people are serious. And he just leaned back in his chair and said, okay, you call me in 6 months after you've had time to survey what you're going to have to do here. And you tell me the license classes of the 10 worst cases in the country. You tell me what they are. So I went through boxes and boxes of cases that had not been worked on because of shortage of staff due to paging and cellular and trunking and SMR and everything else. And the 10 worst cases in the United States were all extra class licenses. So the code had nothing to do with it. The new licensees are not the problem. The no-code techs are not the problem. If they make a mistake, it's innocent. And we want people to make mistakes. That's how you experiment and learn things in amateur radio. You're going to make mistakes. It's the biggest problem in amateur radio is the ones who have the advanced and extra class license. They think they know everything. They don't like newcomers. They don't want to help anybody, but they complain and bitch constantly. And you can hear them on the bands on the three frequencies I told you to stay away from. That's where that type generally congregates. PSK31 was thought for a few that it might ruin amateur radio. That's one of the neatest developments ever. And so these threats are not what we have to worry about. We think they're threats. But the biggest threat on amateur radio, the biggest threat, and I've got a couple of them in this room, the biggest threat is the microphone. That's the biggest threat to amateur radio, what we sound like and how we represent amateur radio. And we've got to be aware of that every single time that we get on and we're ambassadors. We can't expect the FCC to help us. These days, they will help us in the serious cases. They do great work in the most serious cases. We had interference problems on the West Coast for years, and they pursued the case. You might have remembered here a few years back, the Oregon case where the forfeiture was $18,000. And they didn't even do an inspection. They did that evidence research by circling the house with direction finding equipment. And since that came out, I haven't had an interference problem west of the Mississippi, period. I mean, it is quiet out there. So they don't get involved on a daily basis, but when they get involved, the fur is going to fly. And so we try to do as much of that work for them. They rely on that, but by the same token, when we go to them, they listen to us, and they work on these cases. And really, the forfeitures are huge these days. The starting forfeiture for most violations, most cases in amateur radio, the starting forfeiture, and it's really a fine, but it's called a forfeiture because lawyers wrote the rules, and forfeiture has more letters in and it's longer than fine. That's the only reason it's called a forfeiture. But the minimum these days is right around $7,000. And you can say, well, I'll never pay it. They'll never collect it. That might be true, but I know people today whose disability payments are being garnished. by DOJ to collect these forfeitures. When you get a forfeiture like that, you have stomped the tail of a dinosaur. And the message finally got to the brain, and it's just going to be a problem. You don't want to be dealing with that problem for the next 8 or 10 years. Just don't go there, because it's not going to go away. They can garnish your bank account, wages, whatever. It's just, you just don't want to go there. And I have some very unfortunate people who didn't believe that, and they thought that they could get away with it, but it's just always there. And I tell them, just don't go there. It's not worth it. And this is, I suggested that you go to fcc.gov and look at the Daily Digest sometime. This is a Daily Digest. Here's 3 pages long. This is in April. And there's everything on here. TV allotments, Space Bureau has issues, assignments of license authorizations, all kinds of satellite and wireless and non-wireless stuff. So it's not like the old days where RF was 90% of what they did, and most of them were amateurs. So the FCC has a lot to do these days, and they're depending on us to be self-regulating. That's the basic tenet of this service, is self-regulating, and we're trying to get back to that. And we do a lot of work that the FCC doesn't have to do, but when we go to them, and we meet a couple of times a month with them and give them a case, they have been very gracious in taking it and doing something with it. So we have a very good working relationship, I think. And I was looking at I closed about 100 cases in the last couple of weeks where we sent an advisory notice and there were no repeats, and it's been a year or two since that notice was issued. So they are listening to us. We can't do anything about conduct, bad manners, sarcasm, the things you don't like to hear on the bands. And these groups that get on late at night on 75 meters, they haven't had a new idea in 20 years. They haven't done anything but use 1,200 watts to talk across the region for 10 years. They don't like newcomers, but unlike previous years, they don't go out of their way to help them either. It's just a different group of people there. And there's always going to be some percentage of that, whether it's lawyers, plumbers, veterinarians, or whatever. And we got that type of person on the amateur bands. And like I say, those 3 frequencies apparently cause brain damage because there's no other frequencies that do that, that have that type of operator. And we know who they are. And sometimes it's not rule violations. It's just sounding like a horrible representation of amateur radio. And we can't be embarrassed. Anytime we're embarrassed or a little scared to demonstrate amateur radio, there's somebody standing in the radio room. That's not good. And we just can't go there. And if you know people like that, cut them loose. Don't have anything to do with them. I have cut loose a few nets I used to check in regularly to because they got a little bit too risque and they did not represent amateur radio in a good way. So I just got out of it. We are self-regulating and we have to run it ourselves as much as we can. And see, beyond that, I think that's all I had. I gave you some statistics, and mainly the recidivism rate, I think, is the biggest indicator of the health so far. And that's about all I have. But my email is K4ZDH at ARRL.net. Or you can call me directly at 717-476-7379, and I'll get back to you within a day or two if you have some questions that you don't want to bring up tonight. But I'll take any questions that you have.
I neglected to say that if you're a DRC member, Jeff's put up the drawing thing in the chat. So if you're a DRC member, you're welcome if you want to throw your name in the hat for a $25 certificate from HRO, as we do on all the meetings. And Riley, I just wanted something that you said. I mean, it hit home with me, and that's when you said taking the license at a federal building. I took my license in Denver at the new customs house, and it's anything but new. in downtown Denver. And there was a lady there that was, I guess, the secretary, and she was very intimidating. And to this day, I remember her name was Burl. How would I remember that? And I've been a ham for, I think, like 56 or 57 years, but it just come back like that.
Yeah,
Burl.
you don't forget it. It's permanently embedded in your
It
in your
is.
psyche.
Anybody have a quick question for Riley?
And you know, picking up, Jerry, on what you said, I hear that a lot, that the examiners were stern and intimidating. And I knew a lot of them, and they were stern and intimidating, but they wanted you to pass that exam as much as you wanted to pass it in most cases.
Yeah, she was just you knew she was in the room.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, Riley, this is Jeff. Here in Denver, at the Denver Federal Center, FEMA has an installation with a couple of huge log periodic antennas. Does FEMA get involved in any of the monitoring, or is it all strictly FCC facilities that do
It's
that?
the FCC facilities that I've worked with.
Okay.
I don't know that FEMA is involved in any of that.
You know, Jeff, I work for the FAA, and all the centers like Denver Center up north here in Longmont and in Oklahoma City, they all, at least they all did, they had the big Yagi and sometimes 10 kilowatts of power. And I had a good friend that worked at the Los Angeles Center in Palmdale, California, and he had the privilege of maintaining that rig and had the permission to get on in ham frequencies, and it was really
Wow.
cool.
Quick
Anybody
question with the notices that you send out, you mentioned like after a year you'll go back through them and see if they haven't done anything. Do you get a lot of responses to those notices ever, or is it pretty much they get sent out and you never hear anything from
I'd
them?
say it's half and half. The notices regarding FT8 are being off frequency or out of your band. About half of those call back in a panic, and I've had them say, "I'm going to sell my equipment." And I said, "No, don't worry about that. You just made a mistake. You're supposed to make mistakes, but be aware of the band plan." And it's an advisory. That's when we call it an advisory notice. And we don't, I told the league, I said, we can run it so that we aggravate everybody. Everybody hates us, or we can run it so that we kind of bring them into the fold and see the whole purpose of this enforcement and compliance thing. So the letters generally, unless it's the second letter, or unless it's over a very egregious interference issue, they're very nice letters. We invite them to call us back anytime between 8 and 9 o'clock any day. And a lot of them call back, like I say, in a panic, and we've had to calm them down a lot. A lot of them will call back to explain what they did wrong. Some will call back to deny it, but very, very few call back to say this wasn't me. If you have somebody listening on CW and they say a certain person was doing this, they were out of band, the first thing is you got to make sure they got that call sign right. And that's why we will assign it to a volunteer monitor to see if you can verify it. And we want to be sure, but the letter is written with a tone that encourages them to call us back and discuss it. Whether they did or didn't do it, just call us back and we can talk about it. But I'd say probably overall half of the advisory notices that we send out, we'll get a call back and the person will discuss it, apologize, or want to know the reasoning and so forth. Now, if they call back and threaten to sue you, or threaten to sue me, I know I have the right person. Okay, so that's always good news because we know we got the right person then.
Thank you.
Anybody else? How are we doing on the drawing?
We have 7 entries so far.
Oh, well, that improved. So last chance for that. Very interesting, Riley. I mean, it's very informative. And you hit the nail right there on the. I have people tell me, well, I had a member tell me not long ago that, well, I'm gonna drop out of the league. It's just getting too expensive and blah blah blah. And I say, if you love ham radio like most of us do, I don't always agree. I don't think anybody does with everything the league does, but like you said, they're our only voice.
Well, that's the thing that sort of scares me. The cost of print media has
Yeah.
risen
Oh,
astronomically, and you can even see it in the National Geographic magazines. You don't see the same grade of paper that you saw 10 years ago. All membership organizations are having problems with members because young people today, they're not joiners. They're gonna use the cell phone and WhatsApp and messaging and all the stuff that they have on the cell phone. They just don't go to meetings.
Yeah.
And membership everywhere is down. But the problem is, if they're representing amateur radio, they've got to have healthy numbers. If they have just a small percentage of the amateur radio operators, the FCC is not going to consider that a formidable adversary. But if they got a lot of membership, and like you say, I'm sure all doctors don't agree with the American Medical Association or lawyers with the American Bar Association, but they've got to have numbers. And that the league has got to say we represent a very healthy number of amateur radio operators to have any clout with the FCC. Otherwise, they could, people say, well, they can't deregulate us because it's under treaty. That's true. But that's what, there's such a thing as benign neglect, where they could just say, well, they got to regulate themselves. We got other things to do. Short budget, short staff. They're just going to have to take care of themselves. That's the kiss of death. We don't want to go the way of the Family Radio Service or CB or whatever. We've got to have a healthy regulatory body and that has some respect for what we do and the numbers that the league represents.
Well, the other scary thing is,
and not as a league member, but they've got to have healthy membership. Otherwise, the FCC or any other agency is not going to worry about us.
the other scary thing in QSTs, you thumb through there and see the silent keys. My God.
That's exactly right. That's right. And I remember when it used to be a paragraph, but now it's not, because we are aging. We're an aging population. A lot of newcomers are coming in though, thanks to FT8 and the equipment that we have. And I was talking to the head of the league about it, and it's better. The influx now is better than it ever has been. The problem is keeping them interested and getting them above a technician licensee, because it's easy to get bored. And personally, I think that technicians should have more privileges. And if they can operate CW on 40 meters, I don't understand why they can't do FT8. CW is harder to do than FT8. They need more privileges to keep them interested, but it's helping a little bit now that 10 meters is so healthy. It's so wide open. But when you look at the technician privileges, to me, it's not all that much. And I'd love to see them have some more voice privileges.
Oh, we're a pretty large club, and we get new members several every month. And, the repeaters we've got numerous repeaters in there. For the most part, you can go all day long and not hear them key up.
I know it. That worries me. There's a lot of repeaters out there, and there's it seems to me if there's 3 amateurs in a town, there's going to be 2 repeaters. It's just inevitable that that's going to happen, and we need more activity. And an active repeater is fun. I can access 14 repeaters from the rig over here. That's the vintage rig in the back. But honestly, there's very little activity except on 2 of them outside of the regular weekly meeting. And I got to be net control 3 or 4 times this year for the Adams County repeater. It's on Tuesday night. And I'll have to confess this. A couple of months ago, it was a Monday night, and I was thinking it was a Tuesday night. So I started calling Annette at 7:30 on a Monday night. It's met on Tuesday night for 250 years, but I'm calling on Monday nights. Nobody is checking in. And I'm worried about the state of amateur radio. Finally, a lady comes on and says, "This is my husband's radio, but don't you normally do this on Tuesday night?" And then I look at the calendar and said, "Thank you. You helped me a lot." So it's just no call sign or anything. I just turned it off. But it's an active repeater. There's 2 or 3 active ones around here, but it should be more out of the 14 I can access.
Yeah. Okay, very well. Thank you again. Great
Thank
presentation.
you. We'll do it anytime. And like I say, don't hesitate to send me an email or give me a phone call. And if I don't know the answer, I'll find it for you or I'll make up a good one.
Yeah.
Jerry, I'd
Yeah.
like to thank Riley for being with us tonight. It's a real breath of fresh air. Just kind of blows into the call here. And I too remember that woman at the FCC.
Do you really?
I remember.
Burl.
I wouldn't have known the name, and I can't place the face, but it was Burl.
Burl.
And
Yeah.
she was like a warden.
Yeah.
But I agree that she wanted all of us to pass, but properly so.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's good. And I've heard it said before, especially with that old federal building in Denver. You'd walk in the door and the door would slam behind you and it would feel like you were in 1908.
Yeah.
And you came in and it got scarier as you went up to the steps to the second floor exam room, and the examiners were there standing, and so you were terrified. But when you went out the door, you wanted to go out and place a tower in the ground.
What a sense of accomplishment you had. A friend of mine went to Atlanta to take the test, and as he was coming into Atlanta, it was a real hot day. He saw this guy in a white suit with a white dress suit and white hat crossing the street. And just being the smart aleck that he was, he yelled out, "Man, you're going to be hot as hell today in that outfit." So then he parks and goes into the Atlanta office, and there's that same guy coming in to give the exam. It was Angelo Diddy in the Atlanta office. He got so nervous, he went home. He didn't even take the exam.
Yeah.
But everybody remembers that, and you just don't hear that about the. And I have a great deal of respect for the volunteer examiners. They go out of their way, and they're amazing people. But
Plus, the new customs house is the induction center for the military. That's another scary thing in the same place.
Well, the place, the San Francisco office out there, they didn't have a paging system or PA system. If somebody at the desk needed somebody in one of the offices to come up, they used a Morse code key and tapped it out in code.
Yeah.
And that was impressive to a new person taking the exam. The old J38 or J44 sitting there on the desk, and they just tapped out the agent's name, and a few minutes later, the agent came up to the front desk.